Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and rabbis are often asked, why did you become a rabbi? But actually, that question could be asked of anyone. Why did you choose the line of work you're in? It could even be asked of someone who chose to be a Jewish historian. What attracts a man or woman to devote one's professional life to studying and writing and teaching Jewish history? And make no mistake, for the Jewish people obsessed with memory and a sense of history, for the Jewish people who've had such a long, complex, often tortuous history, those who illuminate the Jewish story and who seek to present the most honest, vivid picture of the Jewish people's more than 3,000-year history, journey, make an invaluable contribution to the Jewish present in every generation, and sometimes suggest ways for the Jewish people to approach the Jewish future. And now a book has been published that tells the story of the storytellers, the story of 16 American Jewish historians today, why they became Jewish historians, and what being American Jewish historians has meant to each of them. The book is aptly entitled, Conversations with Colleagues on Becoming an American Jewish Historian. And if you're a regular JBS viewer, it was conceived and edited by someone you know very, very well, a dear friend, Jeffrey S. Gurock, the Libby M. Clapperman Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University, and the author and editor of 18 books, including 2 on the Jews of Harlem, another on Jews of New York City from 1920 to 2010, a book on Jews and American sports, and now Jeff has edited and written his own fabulous Chapter 4, Conversations with Colleagues on Becoming an American Jewish Historian. How lovely it is to have you back at this table.
Well, thank you.
Mazal Tov on the book. Well, beautifully, beautifully done.
It's not my book. It's a book of 16 colleagues and friends, each one of them talking about the journeys they've taken to teach and write American Jewish history and hopefully influence the contemporary Jewish community,
Absolutely.
Scholars and lay people alike.
And I rarely correct you, but I will correct you here. 15 colleagues, you also have your own chapter.
That's correct.
As a 16. Beautifully done. Then lucky us, Jeff has brought with him 2 outstanding figures in the field of American Jewish history. It's a distinct pleasure to be sitting with a man who might well be called the Dean of American Jewish historians, Jonathan Sarna, the Joseph H. and Belle R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University. Jonathan Sarna is also the Chief Historian of the National Museum of American Jewish History and a chair of the Jacob Rader Marcus Center of the American Jewish Archives. Among his many writings, Jonathan is author of the award-winning book, American Judaism, A History. And he's the author of Lincoln and the Jews, A History, a fascinating look at the way Abraham Lincoln took on General Ulysses S. Grant over the issue of anti-Semitism. It is an honor to have you at this table. You know, we've been privileged to have you on JBS in terms of your lectures. This is the first time I've got you here. It cannot be the last. Thank you. And Mazal Tov for all, Yashiko, fabulous, a body of work that is outstanding and really is a monument to what American Jewish life is. And kol hakavod to you.
Thanks so
you.
much.
Thank
I appreciate it.
I'm also pleased to be joined by an award-winning historian associated with the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, JTS, which of course is the Rabbinical School for Conservative Jewry, Shuly Rubin Schwartz, the Irving Lerman Research Associate Professor of American Jewish History, whose book, The Rabbi's Wife, the Rebbitzin in American Jewish Life, received the National Book Award in 2006, and Shuly's also Dean of Graduate and Undergraduate Studies at JTS. What an honor it is to have you here at this table. Thank you, and Mazal Tov for all the work you've done.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
What a kick it is for me to sit with 3 stars. And thank you for making this possible, Jeff. I want the audience to understand it. This book, again, 16 American Jewish historians write in it. They write in some way autobiographically. They tell the story of how they became Jewish historians, but they give us a glimpse into who they are and who their life is. And since you edited the book and conceived the book, I begin with you. You write about how when you're at Columbia, you ask at the time, as you look back, a naive question. Why is there no American Jewish history program? Remember writing that?
Of course.
Okay. And I said to myself, you know, in some way we take American Jewish history now for granted. You're a young student at Columbia. It's a different world. I want you to talk for one moment, and then I'd love your colleagues to comment on the same thing. Sort of relate the story that you tell in the book and how that basically propels Columbia to have its first American Jewish history course.
I think the word propels a little bit too strong, but even back then I was an advocate for a field that I knew very little about. So I'd come to Columbia from City College of New York. I always say I received a wonderful education for $37 a semester.
And by the way, that follows Ramaz.
And that follows Ramaz.
You're a Ramaz kid.
I'm a Ramaz kid, and frankly, I love Ramaz, but interestingly enough, at Ramaz, Jewish history was taught only as far up chronologically as 1492. And we were supposed to be trained, and we were trained, many of us, and Jonathan was at Ramaz for a while, and his brother David was a classmate of mine for a while. We were supposed to be trained as Jewish leaders, whatever that means. And yet the history curriculum never went past that point in time. Ironically, 30 years later, I was called back to Ramaz to help them upgrade their curriculum. But let me get to the Columbia story very, very quickly. I went to Columbia University, understanding that at City College, black history started to be something that was developing on campus. And I said in a very naive way, well, what about us? And I didn't know all the barriers, all the thoughts that Jewish historians and American historians had, that what we were doing was incidental to the American saga, unimportant and the like. So in a naive way, I turned to our professor, Tzvi Ankori, who was a renowned Byzantine scholar, and I said, hey, how about a course in American Jewish history? And we were so lucky because Naomi W. Cohen came over from Hunter College, and Shuly was fortunate enough to study with her as well. And that's how I'm taking credit in a strange way from a naive student.
Yes, and what was the answer? You asked this naive question. There wasn't. What was the answer?
There was no answer, but next thing I knew, Cohen was here and Ankori was on sabbatical. So that was a wonderful combination. And Naomi Cohen raised up a whole generations of students. That
She was very proud of it.
very, very proud of it.
Okay, and the last...
And some of them are represented.
In the book,
yes,
yeah.
for sure.
Okay, and finish the thought, which is really the question of the book. You're a student from Ramaz through City College. Now you're at Columbia. What was driving you to want to be a Jewish historian at all? At all?
Well, my initial hope in life was that I'd be a professional basketball player, but when I found out I couldn't do that, I was fortunate enough at City College to have some outstanding professors of American history. And I became attracted to the life of the professoriate. And I found that when I wrote term papers that I got a very positive response. Hey, I can write a little bit. And then I went to Columbia, and not only did I study with Cohen, but I also studied with Ismar Shoresh, Arthur Hertzberg, and on the American side, urban history with Kenneth Jackson, with whom I'm still in contact, and David Rothman. So I'm a late bloomer, I guess, but that's my journey. So I call my essay, "A Scholar Athlete Discovers American Jewish History." a bit of an idiosyncratic. But you know what? All 15 stories are idiosyncratic in their own
Absolutely.
in their own way.
And lovely. Okay, I want to quote something that you wrote, John, in your chapter. First of all, I find it so interesting. You tell us as a kid, you write a paper. You're asked to write a paper because you're in driving school.
Right.
And you have to write a paper, and you decide you're going to write your paper on the anti-Semitism of Henry Ford.
Right.
And that indicates where you were already in your head. There was something about you and your life, and you give your family credit as well, that Jewishness meant a lot to you, correct?
Yeah, my father was a well-known scholar in Tanakh and Bible. Scholarship was, in some ways, the family business. And but at the same time, I'm the only member of the family born in the United States. So here, one was working out one's place in this country. I loved American history from a young age. And in a way, American Jewish history brought these two experiences together.
Yes.
The Jewish studies and the American history. And it was also a field my dad hadn't entered. My dad wrote in a lot of areas, not American Jewish.
You should
and
tell
it
us your
seemed-
you should tell the audience your father's name.
My father's Nachum Sarna,
Correct.
blessed memory, and although his best-known work is in the Bible, my father really had a capacious knowledge of Jewish
Were you
studies.
close to him?
Yeah. There, I think that a son of a famous scholar, will on the one hand emulate, on the other hand, there are moments where you want to go your own way. But I never rebelled and said I'd be a baseball player, which
I disappointed my parents too. You know.
And it seemed, I mean, from a young age, it was clear that I was good at history and I enjoyed it.
Did you love the Jewish?
Yeah, and I did love that, and the paper even on Henry Ford, which was really about an anti-Semite. Of course, these were rebellious years. This was late 60s, early 70s. And we thought it was ridiculous that they forced us to write a paper.
It was ridiculous.
It was. So I wrote this paper. Of course, what I didn't know is you could get an A on the paper. Teacher told me no one had written such a serious paper. Didn't help you at all when you got behind the wheel and had to drive a car, and that, of course, I failed and had to retake the test. But
Okay, now I want to quote. I want to quote your sentence. Okay, at some point you write, in my undergraduate training, I came to the conclusion that I should make my career American Jewish history. I found that fascinating. By the way, you didn't tell us why. I'm asking you now. Why? At what point and why during your undergraduate training do you decide you're going to make your career American Jewish history?
So I had studied American Jewish history. Brandeis had the American Jewish Historical Society on its campus in those days, and I worked there, and this was what I loved.
It's because you loved it.
But the question was, are there any jobs?
Yes, you say.
And-
Could I
and
make
you
a
train
living?
it. Could you make a living? And so I said, you know what? I'm going to give it a try, and I'm going to do it quickly. And if it doesn't work out, I'll go and become a lawyer like everybody else. So I had a real time limit. If I didn't have a job by 27, then off to law school.
But it did work out for you.
It did work out.
It did work out
Thank God,
to
yeah.
the benefit of all of us.
Well,
To the benefit of all of us. Answer.
And how fortunate was I that I didn't know about all these barriers. Jonathan works at Historical Society. He knows about the lack of respect American Jewish history has in the field. I'm coming into it saying, gee, black history is great. Why don't we do American Jewish history? So that is something, not having to worry about this. I would find out later on how difficult it was, But as a starting point, it's very, very helpful.
Okay. So I read your chapter, Shuly, and you start with Arnon Shimon Shpal.
Yes.
And
My great-grandfather.
Your great maternal?
Maternal.
Okay. Whom you did not know.
Nope.
But somehow, through your family history, he has an impact on you.
Yes.
Explain what that impact is and how that, in some way, brought you into the field of American Jewish history. And your story is fascinating. There is an element, because you're a woman, it's slightly different. You have to navigate a slightly different world than both Jonathan and Jeffrey. But still, tell your story for a moment.
So my maternal great-grandfather, Aron Shimon Shpal, was the clear patriarch of the family. He came from Kremenets in the Ukraine, which was a town where, in the history of that town, we find the text written that this was the only Hebrew-speaking home in that town. So a shorthand way of understanding that is that he was the Eliezer ben Yehuda of that era.
Lovely.
And he was a journalist, an educator, and a scholar in both Hebrew and Yiddish and Russian literature. And he also had in his possession a family history that he had inherited from his mother's family, which actually traced the genealogy back to Rashi. And if you latch on to Rashi's genealogy, you go all the way back to David HaMelech. So with this illustrious yichus, I had a cousin who was working on updating this family history. He passed it on to me, and I ended up writing a large paper in college at Barnard.
About?
And about the family history. It was a way of thinking about the immigration of Jews to the United States through the lens of my particular family story. It was a story about sort of the Jewish nationalist movement. I have a very moving letter from Aron Shimon, where he writes about being sitting on the train to Warsaw as he's leaving in 1922, and most of the people there are headed to Palestine, and he is depressed. He says, I feel diminished in my own eyes because I'm going to Denver. What does Denver say to my soul? And he ends up running a Hebrew Ivrit B'Ivrit, a fully Hebrew Talmud Torah in New Orleans. And that continues to this day. The American Jews speaking a very American accented Hebrew to our children, and continuing that legacy.
Everywhere I look in your life, there are rabbis.
That is true.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Tell our audience.
So the Aron Shimon was from my mother's line, where they were, I wouldn't say anti-rabbi, but the scholarly side certainly took front and center. But my dad was a rabbi. My late husband was a rabbi. Uncles on both my mother and my father's side. My brother-in-law. Now my son is a rabbi.
Isn't that
So
wonderful? Just wonderful.
it's wonderful.
It's
Yes.
wonderful. And your award-winning book is about the rabbi's wife.
Yes.
Why? Why did you choose to write that?
I chose to write that book because of my mother. Although I was a rabbi's wife at the time that I was writing the book, I was really very taken with my mother and her cohort, an entire generation of women in the post-war era. My dad was a rabbi on Long Island for his entire career, and so he and all of his colleagues and their wives went out to, as I told Jonathan earlier today, they said in the Placement Bureau in 1951 at JTS, they said, there's just potato fields out there, so just go and you'll learn a little and then you'll get a real job. But of course, that was the period of the great wave of suburbanization of American Jewish life, and Long Island became a robust home for Jews with many, many congregations, and he spent his entire career there.
Okay, I want the three of you to understand. If any one of you were alone with me at this table, I would probe your individual stories, because the little glimpse that you gave me and give the reader, and it's so kind of you. By the way, you write a courageous chapter, and you're very forthright about the fact that you've confronted serious illness, and you have persevered, and the people around you helped you, and you beat cancer, and here you are continuing to thrive. And it was, I mean, I get chills even thinking about how you wrote that chapter. So, kol hakavod to you. But each of you has a story which, if you were here alone, I just would want to just dig out that story because they're fascinating. Because there are three of you, I have to do it a hair differently. I want to understand how the three of you view not simply your field, but the way in which your field is embraced by the Jewish community as a whole. And if, again, I point out all the rabbis in your background because it places you inside the Jewish community in a very specific way. The same for the two of you. What's your feeling, and I'm asking all three of you, do you have any concern about the level of education or ignorance that is pervasive on the American Jewish scene, which absolutely impacts the way American Jewish historians are received by the average Jew, whether it's in New York, or whether it's in Atlanta, or whether it's in Seattle, whether it's in Chicago, whether it's in some small town in Tennessee or in Texas? What's your sense of the level of Jewish knowledge and the level of Jewish interest in knowledge? Jonathan?
I think that many American Jews have never learned that Jews in America had a history. Many of them don't know that history goes back to the 17th century. Who knew? And when you do teach it to them, they're actually very excited. I did a book on Lincoln, and people didn't know that there's any connection between Lincoln and Jews, or Grant and Jews, or Jefferson, and so on. And too many American Jews think America's somebody else's country, rather than understanding that the Jewish experience is part of the history of the United States as well. And that's been very important. Similarly, we study about American religion. Well, the fact that there's been Judaism in this country makes a difference. Indeed, Jews were the most important non-Christian religion. And that too is significant. And I think there are a lot of young people who are searching for their place as Americans, as Jews. I'm not sure it's so easy for them to study the patriarchs and figure out how to live as a Jew in America. But when you see how earlier generations of Jews lived in America, how they struggled, how they found their way, how they insisted on being Americans and Jews, then it's easy, I think, to relate that directly to your life. So I would love to see more attention paid to American Jewish history, not just stories about heroes. Because if they're all so heroic, they never had a struggle, then it's irrelevant to me. I want people to understand how folks did struggle and came out the other side.
Who's Mordechai Noah?
So Mordechai Noah, on whom I wrote my doctorate, is the first Jew whom we can really talk about, who insists I can be a leading American politician and playwright and active on the American scene, and I can also be a Jewish lay leader.
Yes.
This year is the 200th anniversary of one of his great speeches at Shearith Israel, what we know as the Spanish and Portuguese
Here in
synagogue.
New York City.
And he gives a history of Jews and information about Jews around the world. And he then sends that to President Adams, to President Jefferson, for a haskoma, so to speak, so that they'll know this story. And Jefferson and Adams write back. That's an amazing moment. And Noah was always known as a Jew, and how he managed to be both
And
American and Jewish is important.
You write that model is also something that interested you personally.
Yes.
The challenge the Jew has to, as Mordechai Kaplan would say, have one foot in each civilization.
Yeah.
You know? What do you think about the level of knowledge or ignorance in the Jewish community today?
I certainly would agree with Jonathan. I think that it is, there is hunger that Jews of all ages have, Jews in small towns, Jews in the city, young Jews, older Jews, really to understand who they are as American Jews and what their place is, and to be able to get a glimpse of how ordinary Jews live their lives and struggle with the same questions of how am I going to carry forth both my deep sense of identity, pride, knowledge, curiosity about my Jewishness and my identity as an American. That is something that I think is essential. You know, everyone's going on Ancestry.com to figure out what they can learn. That's a spark that we can build upon to really help Jews at all levels and at different stages of life understand where they came from so that they can figure out where they want to go.
Do you worry about a level of ignorance in the Jewish
Yes,
community?
I do. And I would take the story in a little bit different place. And that is, I think there's a generational issue that has to be addressed. And that is, when we speak to older Jews, people of our age, of this generation, who for a variety of reasons did not receive the quality Jewish education, there's a tremendous yearning to know about American Jewish history. When we give lectures, these are the people who populate our synagogues wherever we may be. So these people are very engaged and very interested. Perhaps their interest is more in the history of the Holocaust than American Jewish history, but be that as it may, if I can talk about a core constituency, they're there and very interested and want to know their family history. They want to know not only what their family did, but how that intersects with larger trends within American Jewish life. So that's one constituency that's very engaged and very concerned. As far as the younger generation is concerned, I would define it as the more, the less, the less. And that is those people who are, and by the way, that term was not my term, it was used by one of our colleagues, a sociologist, years ago, but be that as it may. What I mean by the more, the people who are engaged and feel strongly about the issues that Jonathan and Shuly raised, for them, they're a second core constituency that's very important. On the other hand, in many Jewish studies courses around the country, many of the students are not necessarily Jewish, and they're finding American Jewish history in general for other reasons. And one of the challenges that I don't face, and Shuly doesn't face, and to a lesser extent Jonathan doesn't, teaching at Jewish institutions, explicitly Jewish institutions or large-scale Jewish institutions, is interesting Jewish students to take these Jewish studies courses and to engage in Hillel work, etc. All those types of things are important, but it isn't as if there's a tableau out there that says just come take our courses, and that's so. Strangely enough, the professionalization of the field has taken place. There's greater acceptance of our field as a discipline, but the word I used earlier, and that is advocacy for Jewish identity, is something that has to be addressed by our colleagues at universities all over the country.
Who is taking the Jewish historian more seriously? I thought you said a moment ago that your field is regarded in a higher fashion than it would have been when, as a kid, you say at Columbia, hey, how come there's no Jewish studies? And you've made reference to it now twice, that there is an evolution of the way in which the American Jewish historian is regarded and how your field is regarded. And when you tell me it's gotten better, in whose eyes?
In all eyes, both American historians or Jewish historians, although there are still barriers to be overcome, some people don't take us seriously. But I want to say, because of work that these two people do and the other colleagues, when you do quality work that intersects with what American historians are thinking about or Jewish historians are thinking about, I think it helps overcome initial prejudices towards the field. You can't turn down Sarna's work because Sarna's work is good and Rubin Schwartz's work is good. My stuff is okay. But in all seriousness, the way the field became accepted was because there was a greater acceptance of the idea of a multicultural history for America. And secondly, due to the training that we received as American historians and Jewish historians, Jonathan said it 2 nights ago, that you have to be trained as an American historian, American Jewish historian, and a Jewish historian. If you have those 3 pieces and you do quality work, only the naysayers par excellence will turn you down. And I think that's led to greater acceptance of our field. Having said that, there are still those people who don't see us as nearly as scholarly. I often say
in academia?
In academic circles, we don't, I always say, we don't study Rashi, we don't study the Tosafos, we don't study Maimonides. I study things like economic mobility and, God spare me, sports and the like, and it can be done seriously.
You do it seriously.
I know, but there's still some barriers that need to be overcome in people's minds. And the only way you can overcome them is by doing good work and not worrying about whether you're accepted on some other street.
What do you think of what Jeff said?
At a certain point, you have to stop worrying about what other people will think.
I don't want you to worry. I just want to know what you experience the reality.
Do your best.
What's the reality, Jonathan?
There are certainly people who believe still that everything after the 18th century is journalism. Okay, but I think that the field of American Jewish history today is much more respected. Books are published by the major university presses, Harvard, Yale, Princeton. And when I began my career, that wasn't the case. I started a series with the Moses Rishon at Wayne State University Press so that there would be a way of publishing books, good books in American Jewish history, and people were grateful. And today, those same people would publish those books at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Oxford, and Cambridge. And that bespeaks, I think, the transformation that the field has undergone. I would also say that there have been some very significant films about American Jewish history, the Jewish Americans, a film about the Civil War, Jews, black, blue and gray. And that's made a difference. And the best of those films, I think, have likewise excited people. There is a history. We should learn that history. And of course, now, where so many American Jews are 3rd and 4th generation, let me learn about my family's history, which often is a history in America in a way that it wasn't when we began.
Yes, and Shuly, you sort of referred to that. From your perspective, I asked Jeff, is the field of Jewish history more respected in academia? And both Jeffrey and Jonathan have spoken to that. I also wanted to know whether you feel it is more respected in the synagogue world, among the average Jewish community, do you think the role of the historian is viewed in a better light than it might have been? Or do you feel that basically, again, in general, the average Jew, either they're into history or they're not into history at all?
Look, I think that when you're talking about American Jewish history, I don't think that the average Jew needs to be, obsessed with history to care about American Jewish history, because that's our story. And so naturally, when Jews want to know, they want to know about their parents, they want to know about their grandparents. So they find some letters while they're cleaning out a great aunt's apartment, and this then becomes a gold mine. And for many American Jews, they don't know what to do with this material. They don't have the context to put it in, and they don't really know how to make sense of it, and they're eager and curious to find out more. And that can help them, with the help of historians, can help them see how that particular story fits into a larger
Okay.
picture.
I want a general question for all three of you. In many of our conversations, you've said to me, I'm a historian. I'm not a prophet. I'm not a prognosticator about what's going to happen. At the same time, there is a feeling that learning from history can help one navigate problems that one faces in the future. So I want to hear all of you speak to the extent to which is the work you do a way that gives the Jewish reader, do you hope in any way it's going to help them deal with their Jewish future? Jonathan?
The Rabbi Jonathan Sachs recently wrote a wonderful thing in which he pointed out that if a prediction comes true, that's a success. If a prophecy comes true, the prophet has failed. And in a way, that's how I feel.
Why is that?
Because many of our prophecies are really meant to encourage people to change their ways and make sure that the seeming inevitable doesn't happen. So people who study American Jewish history time and again read prophecies. This will be the last generation. Jews in America will assimilate away.
Yes.
That was true in the 17th century, in the 18th, in the 19th, in the 20th, and in our day. Well,
You mean Jews have always been worried about?
we are the ever-dying people.
Right.
But
And the young people
right,
don't
and they won't,
care.
and they're
19th century,
over and over. Now, and that was right, but that's a prophecy. It's said in a way to inspire people, young people, to take history by the reins and say, we are going to bring back Jews to Judaism. We're going to shake up the synagogue so people want to come. We're going to create new educational institutions that will educate American Jews. And over again, we've seen programs and institutions, some of them very unlikely, summer camp, but yes, that made a revolution. We're going to take 10 days and send them to Israel, but that made a revolution. So my hope is, by seeing how earlier generations saved American Jewry, some young people are going to be inspired and say, we can save it too.
That's wonderful.
So I want to quote a different philosopher, Dizzy Dean, who once said that if you make a prediction and you're wrong, you're a fool. If you're right, then it's just darn good predicting, okay? I want to talk about something else, and that is, in 2018, a lot of American Jews are concerned about the emergence of the alt-right, of resurgence of anti-Semitism, with no
Which you have written a great deal about.
Right. With no understanding of to what extent this is comparable and not comparable to what American Jews
Very interesting.
felt previously. There's autobiographical stuff in all these essays. I didn't write about the fact that in 1942, before my father was scheduled to go into the Navy, he and my mother went to New Hampshire, the height of the off-season, and they came to a hotel, and it said, no Jews, dogs, or consumptives allowed. And since it was the off-season, they said to my Leah and Jack Gurock, you can come in because nobody else is here. And my father gave the equivalent of the Bronx cheer, and he went someplace else. We've never, in my lifetime, we've never experienced this type of thing. And when you talk about the alt-right and Charlottesville, very frightening. And by the way, we should, as Jews, we should oppose it and fight it, etc. We should also understand that in 1938, that Madison Square Garden, not for a basketball game or a hockey game, German-American Bund has a Washington's birthday commemoration, and they have pictures of Washington and Adolf Hitler emblazed in the garden. So it's important to teach about how American Judaism has revived over the course of generations. It's also important for Jews to understand to what extent we are challenged by anti-Semitism and to what extent these are good days for American Jews in terms of the social acceptance. And with the social acceptance, we've often said, comes the challenges of survival. Survival. If you're forced to live in a Jewish neighborhood, willy-nilly you'll end up remaining Jewish. Greater challenges. But the optimistic view is that we've overcome other challenges, and we will as well. But anti-Semitism should be understood and dealt with by ADL, American Jewish Committee, and what we should do is study it, teach it, write about it, so people have the appropriate context to understand where this moment in time fits in.
You mentioned the anti-Semitism example. I think about, the way neighborhoods change, and it's so easy to bemoan, the membership is down in our synagogue and the young people aren't here. And where are the young people? They're back in Brooklyn, where my grandmother had to move out of Brooklyn and
They're in
move
Park
to Queens,
Slope,
and now
living a very nice
she
life.
would just
Right.
find it hilarious that now they're back in those brownstones that she left. So, there are so many ways in which Jewish life has been enriched and reinvented in ways that Jews couldn't have imagined. The impact of feminism, particularly the rich involvement of women in Jewish life, these are things we could not have predicted.
Mm-hmm. From your perspective at JTS, do you worry right now for the Jewish future?
Well, you're asking me on a good day because I just came from commencement, and I'm
Good. I'm
very buoyed at the thought of these graduates going out and having an impact
That's
on
a
the
lovely.
Jewish world.
Are you worried for the Jewish future?
Well, at Yeshiva University, I'm not worried for the Jewish future because we have students who have chosen for intensive Jewish education and environment. Do I worry for the Jewish future? Absolutely, absolutely. Again, the more, the less, the less. The question is to increase the more number at the expense of the less number. That's our challenge.
You've done so much work, not only on American Judaism, but also on anti-Semitism. As you look at where Jews are today, from any perspective, are you concerned about the Jewish future? Or as it's fascinating to hear a historian say, these issues are not new. The Jewish, how did you describe it? It's the always vanishing people? Okay.
Never dying
Oh, I mean,
people.
at the same time, I'm asking you,
Yeah,
from
no,
your perspective,
honestly, I think 3 days a week I'm pessimistic, 3 days a week I'm optimistic, and on Shabbos I think, how do we get from one to the other?
that's a brilliant answer. I'm going to leave it right there. I'm going to ask you a different kind of question, a professional question to all three of you. Are you worried for the future of Jewish studies on college campuses? To what extent, right now, you started by talking about how one of the goals of this marvelous book is for the next generation of Jewish historians. So do you worry that the Jewish studies departments are a passing phenomenon, and that do you ever worry that, I don't know, next 10, 20, 30 years, there'll be less opportunities because Jewish studies programs will be in some way curtailed? What do you think, Jeffrey?
Well, it's a challenge for the humanities in general at universities, where colleges and universities are more concerned with science than the humanities. So we are a subset of that.
Yes.
Fortunately, we're a professional subset. We came into the field at a fortuitous time. Things have changed. I didn't mention this at the outset, but one other motivation for this book was 2 years ago. We have a biennial scholars conference for the American Jewish Historical Society, which this guy thought of initially, and we've gone on ever since. And we had a session. I organized a session called How I Wrote My First Book. And I invited Hasia Dina and Deborah Dashmore, who's been on your show, and myself, to talk about our first book. And we thought very few people would show up. Turns out we had a pretty large crowd, and during the question and answer period, a lot of the young people got up and said, you know, you all were fortunate enough to write your first book. You got jobs, you got tenures, and et cetera. What about us? And again, I said this in passing. There are people out there, and we're having our Scholars Conference again in June in Philadelphia. There are people doing marvelous work. And I give them a lot of credit because but the job market in humanities and in Jewish studies is very, very difficult. And when you see someone who published a book and she identifies herself as an independent scholar, her independence is not what she wanted. So am I concerned about it? Yes, I'm very concerned.
What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, I totally agree with Jeff. It's really part of the larger crisis of the humanities. Shakespeare scholars are worried, and philosophers are. I don't think Jewish studies is more endangered than other areas of the humanities, because actually often generous Jewish communal figures donated chairs, and they want someone to sit in that chair. But the university, understandably, sees there are all these students who want to study STEM subjects. They want to study computer science, and it's hard to say, I'm going to invest in Jewish studies when parents tell their kids, at most one course a year in the humanities, you've got to have a job. But I do think that we're beginning to recognize that people who study the humanities actually do better in some of those STEM fields. They're more creative. They can think outside the box. And once Google and Microsoft and Facebook let it be known that they are giving preference to folks with broad educations, then I think we may see a return to the study of humanities. But it hasn't happened yet.
That's cyclical too.
Yeah.
That's cyclical too.
But I actually do think that there's something particular to be concerned about in terms of Jewish studies, because I think Jewish studies is often seen as a field that may be for a minority that is does not need to be catered to in the same way that it did a generation ago. And there are chairs that were in Jewish studies, and if the donor isn't around anymore, so the religion department might say, we really need a Buddhist scholar now, and we don't look at the enrollments in the classes. The enrollments have fallen because I think certainly many Jewish students feel that it feels too parochial to study their own heritage, and they want to do, Asian studies.
Is she right?
If they're even in the humanities anymore.
So that bespeaks the malaise of contemporary times among a lot of young Jews, and it manifests itself in the fact that a generation ago, or 2 generations ago, I didn't have a good Talmud Torah or yeshiva education. I want to study Jewish materials. This generation, there are still those who are very committed, and we love having them, but there are also people who aren't interested in being Jewish generally. Mm-hmm. So why? And then from the university perspective, a provost might say, hey, go to the Goldberg and say, let's move that chair into maybe even into physics, but maybe also into Mideastern studies.
Okay. Look, this doesn't affect the 3 of you, so it may be an unfair question, but to any extent is the anti-Israel movement within academia and the fact that we're always fighting a BDS on college campuses. Does that in any way, do you think, impact Jewish studies on those college campuses?
I have no doubt.
Yes,
I have
yes.
no
Yes,
doubt.
yes, yes.
I'd like to think there are some people who say, I want to learn more and figure out why they say these
I wish
terrible
they said
things.
that. Yes.
And there are some, but I have no doubt that there are places where sheer prejudice has led people to oppose Jewish studies. I think perhaps we have to do more to remind people how central the Jewish contribution to Western civilization
People
is.
don't know.
And, we call it humanities, and we really need to underscore
But
some of
just
those
your
points.
saying that is such a throwback. I mean, we thought that we
yeah, I
were
agree with that.
Past it?
past that
Yeah.
100 years ago.
You got to
and here
teach
we
the
are.
same lesson
That's right.
over and over.
A few days ago, I made the point that 50, 60 years ago, American history was a history of elites, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men. And then there's a bright, shining moment where, as part of cultural pluralism and a variety of other things, we piggybacked upon that, and that helped build Jewish studies, and as a subset, American Jewish history. So there are places, and again, I'm very insulated. She's insulated. Jonathan's on a very large Jewish campus. But it's interesting that our Association for Jewish Studies is going to have a panel or a round table about how we as Jewish professors, Jewish history professors, deal with these issues on our college campuses.
Very
So clearly
interesting.
they're a lot. So in terms of American history, the narrative of American history that's emerging is talking about the underclass of people economically, socially, and the like. And our story, we have to, again, the verb again, we have to advocate for our story to being told that we're not just people who did very well. We started off as very poor people, and things have changed in terms of, so looking down the road, again, Jonathan's right, we have to do what we do, but there is an issue on campus, and AJS is a good example of that.
Okay. We're nearing the end. I love talking to the three of you. I'm going to ask you an unfair question, but I still want to hear the answer. American Jewish historian. In terms of your self-identity, which word is more important to you, Jewish or historian?
For me, Jewish. Yes,
For you, American Jewish historian, between the words Jewish and historian, who are you?
Jewish defines my life, and history is what I practice. It may be how I think, but Jewish, for me, has been very much at the center.
Yes, and I'm asking you really, when you do Jewish history,
Right.
is your perspective, I'm a historian who happens to be Jewish, or I'm a Jew who's doing history?
I can't ever forget that I'm a Jew, but at the same time, I would never distort the history because I felt, it doesn't show
There's an
Jews in a
integrity to
perfect
history.
light.
Yes.
I think a part of being a professional historian is you follow the documents, and there are Jewish crooks, and there are righteous Jews, and they're all part of this story.
You know, I write about black-Jewish relations, and one of the things that I often talk about is the fact there's no one Jewish attitude towards blacks and no one black attitude towards Jews. So I engage that type of question, and I write in my essay that part of my consciousness about dealing with these things is that when I was at a school which was 90% white, all of a sudden black students appear on the scene, and I find myself as a member of a Jewish minority on campus. That raises my conscience. But at the end of the day, I feel that I was trained mostly as a Jewish historian. I'm concerned with the internal life of the Jews. But at the end of the day, what's most important to me is that I'm a Jew, and I'm raised Jewish children, and fortunately we have Jewish grandchildren.
I love all three of you.
That's who I am.
By the way, as we end, I want to go back to the beginning, and I want to know whether you liked it or in any way did I offend you. I said that the three of you were storytellers. And that in my mind, the historian has a role that tells the Jewish story if you're a Jewish historian. Did the fact that I said that you tell stories, did that in any way bother you?
Not at all.
Not at
That's
all.
what we do.
That's who I am.
That's
Yes.
who you are. The three of you tell the story of the Jewish people over here. Kol hakavod to all three of you. This is wonderful. I hope everyone, by the way, you might think, oh, this is a book for within the professional world. This is a book for anyone, any American Jew who wants a better sense of who they are and why you are who you are and the role that Jewish history plays as we continue this Jewish journey. They should get this book, Conversations with Colleagues on Becoming an American Jewish Historian. Thank you so very
you.
much. Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much. All of you are doing spectacular work. I love you for bringing these people here today. Thank you very, very
Thank you.
much.
They're good friends.
Thank you.
There you have it. I hope you've enjoyed meeting American Jewish historians Jonathan Sarna, Shuly Rubin Schwartz, Jeffrey Gurock, and Jeff's edited a book of essays by 16 American Jewish leading historians. He's one of them. Conversations with Colleagues on Becoming an American Jewish Historian. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to any of the ideas expressed on this edition of L'Chaim. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook page, or tweet me. I look forward to hearing from many of you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'Chaim, my friends, to life.
L'Chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.